Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Faithful Presence Podcast. I am your host, Michael Langer, ordained minister and founder of Faithful Presence, a ministry in our nation's capital, equipping servants and leaders to flourish as they participate in Christ's mission of making all things new. We do that through providing spiritual, emotional, relational, vocational, ideological, cultural, and evangelical formation, which spells service, as it should. A fully formed disciple is one who serves. And we also work with churches to help them equip their own members for Christ-centered participation in the public square. So we're so glad that you are with us. Joining us today is David Bahnsen. David is the founder and managing partner, chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a national private wealth management firm with offices in Newport Beach, New York City, Nashville, Minneapolis, Austin, Phoenix, and West Palm Beach. And he manages, let's just say, a lot of money. He's frequently listed as one of the top financial advisors in America by, people who don't know anything about that, like Barron's and Forbes and the Financial Times. You may have seen him on Fox News, Fox Business, CNBC. So notice what I did right there. This gentleman has been on Fox News and CNBC. So we got both ends of the spectrum, which is good. He's a regular contributor to National Review and to World. He's also a founding trustee of Pacifica Christian High School of Orange County. He serves on the board of directors of the Acton Institute, which anyone who listens to this podcast regularly knows that I am absolutely indebted to. He's a senior fellow of economics for the Center for Cultural Leadership. He's a longtime faculty member for both the Acton Institute and the Blackstone Fellowship of the Alliance Defending Freedom. He is passionate about the integration of faith and economics and has lectured and written for years about the theology of wealth and the marketplace. And as do many of my friends, he responds to the term Kuyperian. He is very appreciative of Tim Keller, my favorite Presbyterian, and Father Robert Sirico, my third favorite Catholic, and his late father, Dr. Gregg Bahnsen, who wrote a number of books on both apologetics and post-millennialism, was his dad. And his dad taught me so much of what I know about apologetics. And just if you've ever listened to David Bahnsen talk on any of the podcasts that he's on, you will notice him using this kind of presuppositional form. He's written a number of books. The most recent one is called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Your Life, where he makes, and he's going to talk about this, a pretty strong case for a work-life balance. David Bahnsen, thank you for coming on the program. Tell us a little bit about your affinity for work-life balance.
Well, it's definitely a concept that I find to be totally reprehensible or outside the realm of reality. The very terminology bothers me, and so I wrote a chapter in my book repudiating the idea of work-life balance, both in what people really mean and their agenda behind the vocabulary, which is, I think, essentially degrading work, but also in the literal vocabulary, what the terminology actually says, which I consider to be philosophically and theologically incoherent. And luckily, the scripture provided us the language that we need and the language that we ought to be using, which is a work-rest paradigm. God created the world in 6 and rested on the 7th, and asked us to work for 6 and rest for 1. And I believe in that as a blessing that God made for us, for our benefit. Work-life balance implies that there is something at odds with work and our lives. They are in tension with one another. when in fact work is a vital and very blessed part of our lives. Something that is a part of the whole doesn't need to be balanced with the whole. And we know this. Nobody disagrees with that, because nobody goes around talking about marriage life balance or church life balance or kid life balance. For some reason, the one category that people like to put at odds with their life is work. Now, Karl Marx thought that work was at war with nature, and that there was in our lives an internal tension because of the oppressor of the proletariat. But that isn't historically what Christians think about creative, productive activity being at war with our lives. So work-life balance, I think, is terminology that may very well be used innocently and innocuously by many, but I think is actually very dangerous language.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So, speaking of work, I think we'll just kind of start at the beginning here. Tell us how the son of such a renowned theologian ends up managing billions of dollars of wealth, and how that, I'm sure you've probably heard it, how are you kind of, seems like you're kind of working in favor of mammon, right? Here you are trying to get more people to accumulate more wealth. How does the son of a pastor end up doing what you do? And how do you respond to people who say, well, you know what? Christians aren't supposed to be overly wealthy, and they're certainly not supposed to try to figure out ways to maximize wealth.
Gosh, I'm glad I don't hear that more often. It would be rather bizarre if someone were to word it so explicitly. Generally, what people will do is use more couched language because they don't want to say what they really think, which is, for someone who gets up every day and themselves goes out and tries to accumulate money but isn't very good at doing it, they want to know where somebody gets off being good at doing it. And so they're not really upset about the accumulation of wealth or the pursuit of a better life for them and their family, or for more capacity for generosity or more productive activity. It's generally just rooted to rank covetousness, which is why God chose to end the 10 Commandments with the climax of thou shalt not covet. It's really embedded in the human heart, unfortunately, on this side of the fall. There isn't any theological basis for believing that the preservation of capital or the accumulation of capital, which are the goods and services that enhance our standard of living, is sinful. There is no theological argument for that. So I think that where people get surprised that not just the son of a pastor is involved in the stewardship of capital and the accumulation of capital for a living, I think they're more surprised that it has gone well. That's kind of the thing a lot of Christians are not used to. We don't really have to worry about people out there pursuing a career as a lawyer or an entrepreneur or a corporate executive, or in my case, a money manager, if they're never doing it at any level that would seem to be notorious or noteworthy or whatnot. And I think that there is apparently a surprise that someone who is not just the son of a pastor, but the son of a very distinctive pastor, very worldview minded, very philosophical, very intellectual. And the fact that it surprises people, I guess, says a lot about the state of the church. It ought to be the norm. We ought to meet people in the Christian community all the time that are flourishing in their chosen endeavor. That they are the son of a pastor should be perfectly consistent and logical with vocational pursuits and success and every good endeavor. The fact that it surprises people, I guess, either says something about them or something about the state of the church.
Yeah, so as we were talking a little bit before we came on, I was in sales and sales management. I sold industrial process equipment to chemical plants for 15 years before I went to seminary. And I chose Covenant Seminary really just for one reason. They were associated with Francis Schaeffer, who I loved. I'd read a lot of his work. He appealed to me, and at the time, I was not a Presbyterian. I was maybe a 5-point Calvinist. I was just going to a Bible church. And when I got to Covenant, the whole Reformed, redemptive, historical thing just kind of clicked and fell in place. But along the way, I met Anthony Bradley, who is one of the distinguished fellows at Acton, and was asking a number of questions in one of the practical theology classes. And he said, "Hey, I want to send you to San Juan Capistrano." This is probably 2005, maybe, to this thing called the Acton Institute. And I'll be honest, I looked at it and recognized, oh, wait, there's Catholics involved in this. That's probably bad. Like it must be liberal in some way, because at the time, my box for evangelical Christianity was pretty small and very denominationally tied. But I went to that. I did all the readings. I came back, and I was forever altered. I think that's kind of what started the clock ticking for me, ending up doing what I'm doing now. I'd love to hear from you, because you're heavily engaged in Acton. Talk a little bit about Acton, what Acton is, and how you got drawn to Acton and the conversations that they're having.
So Acton is an ecumenical think tank that was founded by my dear friend, Father Robert Sirico, and the current president of Acton, Chris Marin, in the very early 1990s. It is a think tank focused on the study of religion and liberty, and essentially laying out a philosophical and theological case for free society. What, in the context of a Christian worldview, they root it heavily to Christian tradition, to Catholic social thought, as well as Kuyperian orientation. There's a diversity, but a consistency of theological basis for arguing for specifically biblical anthropology, and a study of the human person that it becomes the foundation for what we believe about markets. So the way in which economics is understood to the Acton Institute must start with what we believe about who is engaged in markets, which are people interacting, trading, exchanging, buying, selling, producing, consuming. These activities that we think of as market activities start with the people behind them. And so Acton has really formulated a think tank around anthropology as the basis of economics. Now, this is very consistent with some of the classical economic and Austrian economic schools of the last few hundred years, yet Acton's distinct views about the human person are rooted to Christian theology. That's why I say the biblical anthropology. So the think tank, of course, exists to promote scholarship in this regard, conferences, events, writing, debating, and generally advocating for a free and virtuous society. I began reading material out of the Institute about 20 years ago, had been a very rigorous student of economics since I was a very, very young person. And like most free marketeers, had just deeply appreciated reading Friedrich Hayek and Adam Smith and Milton Friedman and other giants of free market thought, and finding someone that was really able to reorient a lot of these blessed conclusions that had come out of classical and market economics, rooting them more holistically to my Christian worldview. It was really quite profound in the impact it had in my life. And so Father Sirico became a very dear friend in 2006, and I began sponsoring conferences with Acton every year in Southern California, right around that time period. Eventually became a faculty member myself a few years later at their annual Acton Institute, which now has 1,000 people come to Acton University a year in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for a whole week in June. And as you mentioned at the beginning, I now serve as a trustee at the Institute as well.
Yeah, so a couple of the things that, they were said, they were like, okay, well, this is obviously clearly true. Why have I never by the time I went to seminary, I was 36. I'd been going to church for probably 20 years. I became a Christian when I was 17. I had never heard sermons about work. I'd heard sermons about you work so that you can give money to the church. I'd heard sermons about you work so that you can leave a tract in the bathroom. I'd heard sermons about the Bible matters to work because it teaches you not to steal the stapler and to show up at work on time. But I'd never heard a sermon about the actual benefits of work, how we were designed for work, how work leads to flourishing, and then concepts like the market and the difference between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, and looking at those things through a biblical lens. And so one of the things that I just love for you to talk about is, I'm sure that you are aware that there is this kind of dearth in the church of talking on this issue, of speaking on this issue. And it does seem like we're making some progress in the right direction, but I wonder if you have insights, especially, your dad being who your dad was, if you have insights on how did the church end up in this place where we have spent so little attention on something that is creationally important?
Well, I think that there are two different answers I have on this. I think about it all the time. It's a really great question. And I kind of differentiate a little bit between what I consider to be two different problems. One is the church's inadequate addressing of the subject of economics, and one is the church's inadequate addressing of Christians in work. And they're very correlated. There's overlap in the sort of Venn diagram, but I think there's a little bit of different origin in both. And so in my new book, I write about the inadequacy of how Christians deal with vocation, with calling. And I believe a lot of it has to do with the 20th century retreatism from the public square. Early in the 20th century, the church was rather consistent in wanting to retreat from public life across almost all domains: science, politics, education, and yes, the marketplace. And yet what happened was, by the end of the 20th century, the results were so uncomfortable by having retreated from politics and education that they decided to re-engage. And sometimes we can think they re-engaged well, sometimes we can think they re-engaged poorly, but nobody can really deny that in both education and politics, there's been a quite fervent, reversal of what was early 20th century escapism. I don't believe that they changed with the marketplace, though. What they did is they tried to adapt, build a faith and work movement on top of a sort of escapist, pietistic mentality towards work, where they wanted to Christianize it, they wanted to sacralize it, but they weren't prepared theologically to actually consider it inherently valuable. So they did what you said, where they talked about how by working you can tithe, by working you can support the church, by working you can, provide for your family. And then the faith and work movement said, what would be nice is if we're going to have everyone do work for all these transactional or utilitarian purposes, we may as well do a men's breakfast once a month and let a bunch of guys, pray together on their way to the office and some things like that, all of which I think is really good. It's great. Right. And I think that the faith and work movement's growth over the last 20 or 30 years is a step in the right direction, but it was not rooted fundamentally to a Kuyperian understanding of work, to the lordship of Christ. It was not rooted to those things. And so that's where I think the church has been shortcoming around work. And then I do argue in the book, and I think it's probably one of the more challenging and maybe for some people offensive chapters, but I also think that there's a sort of embedded conflict that so many pastors, I think, are themselves not the hardest working people on the planet, that they're very naturally uncomfortable preaching a rigorous message of work, where it might be a little bit at odds with what they model themselves. The economic issue, on the other hand, is, I think, in a lot of ways, a byproduct of the church being intimidated by some of the more intellectual concerns of life. And this has been a trend since the Enlightenment. Nancy Pearcey argues in her masterful book, Total Truth, that much of the retreatism of the 20th century came about because of Christians sort of surrendering up against the forces of modernism and Darwinism. Economics is something that Christians just feel more comfortable saying, let's let the secular rationalist run this. We like the political consequences of what Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman have said, or if you're on the left, we like the political consequences of what some of the more Keynesian left-wing social justice, whatever the case may be, implications are. But getting into the nitty-gritty of economics is just worldly and intellectually daunting. And I think that the church has been comfortable to keep it at a distance. And I'm not comfortable keeping it at a distance. I think entrepreneurialism, I think that vocational theology, I think that risk-taking, I think these things are really vital in the Christian life and really vital to have a Christian society. And so I'm really excited to try to introduce economics to those in my circle of influence in a way that would be vital to the Christian life and a Christian understanding.
One of the things I want to ask you kind of goes down that road. I think it was maybe a month ago on your podcast. I think it was the Dividend Cafe, where you were doing a here's what to expect in the upcoming election. Here's what happens if Republicans win. Here's what could happen if Democrats win. One of the things I appreciated that you said was very little changes. Like there's not necessarily like a big, I think it was like 7.6 versus 7.7, the amount of things that they can get through the change. But one of the things that you said I thought was very, very important, and that is that personnel is policy. And like, so the ministry that we do, we are primarily, and at least in our Washington footprint, we are primarily ministering to people who do not work on the Hill. So cabinet agencies, think tanks, policy centers, stuff like that. So oftentimes when I visit a church, one of the things that they will refer to Washington as is, are you having any luck draining the swamp? And my immediate response to that is, there are so many things wrong with what you just said theologically that I don't even know where to start. But referring to work, the work that these people do, as like somehow swampish is completely inappropriate, because the folks that I know are working very, very hard at trying to provide for the flourishing of as many people as they can possibly provide for. But to your earlier point about this kind of like retreat from science and retreat from economics, we know, we have this data now empirically that when you ask Christians what role the Bible plays in their life, they will score in the 70s and 80s on the Bible helps me feel connected to God and a sense of knowing God better. But when you start asking them, does the Bible inform your economic outlook, the way you think about the criminal justice system, the way you think about people displaced by refugees, the way you think about foreign policy decisions at work, those scores go into the teens and 20s. And that's the church's fault. And so then you end up with people coming into government who want to serve, who want to, quote unquote, change the world. And they're here, but that's the level of discipleship that they have. So when they're involved in these policy discussions, they don't know how do I use Ruth and Boaz as the middle road between stakeholder capitalism and free market capitalism, that Boaz senses that he knows he could be more wealthy, but he would have to do things that were morally wrong to do it. So talk about the importance of Christian discipleship as it relates to the truth that personnel is policy, that we do have an opportunity for Christians to actually be sitting at a table where decisions are made.
Well, let me get to the issue of defending the notion, which is entirely biblical, that personnel is policy, that so much of what will come about in the public square is a byproduct of the people that are presenting it. But first, if you don't mind, I want to push back on the idea that when we adopt a fully biblical understanding of these issues, and you use example of Ruth and Boaz, but there are various Christian stories and tales and lessons that they represent a middle road between free markets and something that would be whether it's a modern notion of stakeholder capitalism or any number of other versions of the case. I don't think that what we're trying to do is put the Bible somewhere in the middle of these various issues. It's to understand where these issues are themselves as it pertains to the Bible. Is there something about a free market position that is inherently anti-biblical? And this is where I want Christians to get comfortable with the notion that all at once, a free society is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a holistically Christian understanding of human action. That we're not trying to get the temperature right between freedom and alternatives to freedom. We're trying to understand what it means to have freedom and where that becomes relevant in our economic transactions, in political economy, and also just the good life. What does it mean to have shalom? What does it mean to pursue human flourishing? What are these concepts really about? So I think that there is a tendency to create tensions between things that sometimes may not necessarily exist, but what we do have an opportunity to do is more robustly define them. And I love my friend Sam Gregg talking about the self-interest that Adam Smith kind of coined to some degree. We attribute a lot of the language of self-interest to the famous work of Adam Smith in his masterful book, The Wealth of Nations. And Sam Gregg talks about enlightened self-interest. Christians who want to deny that self-interest exists as a driver of productive activity are simply playing games with vocabulary and with the obvious reason and rational faculties of human nature. We most certainly do operate in self-interest, and God made us to do so. But we also do not operate in self-interest divorced from a moral compass. We also ought not to operate in self-interest without regard for the needs of others. There is a biblical ethic about these things that Sam Gregg refers to as an enlightened self-interest. So I think all of these concepts are very important as we unpack it, but not because we are looking to neuter a commitment to a free economy, but rather because we're trying to better define what the ideal free economy really looks like. Personnel as policy is a very easy case to make. The Bible talks over and over again about the personification of some of these different attributes, that where there are good people, where there are good leaders, where there are wise men and women, that's where all of these positive things are born from. That we do not just get ideas right, divorced from people who implement ideas. That the articulation of ideas, the execution of ideas, that the technique matters. These things flow out of embodied people. This is so important theologically that Jesus himself, in becoming the Messiah, to pay the price for our sins, became fully man. The incarnation, one of the most basic theological concepts of Christian theology, speaks to the humanity of God. That's how important these things are, that they are lived out, that we do not merely have the Word, but in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus did not just give us the teachings, he lived and walked with mankind. Personnel matters. The disciples mattered. The apostles mattered. Now, I'm not making a spiritual equivalent between Treasury Department officials and Federal Reserve governors and the apostles. I'm merely stating that the concept of the people mattering has all sorts of tradition and heritage in the way we understand these things. If I had a magic wand and I could pick between passing any law I want right now or getting to staff and administration with people I want right now, I wouldn't even think for a second about which one I'd prefer. Right. Personnel trumps policy, because policy ultimately follows personnel every time.
Yeah, that's my experience is, regardless of kind of which party, I tell people, regardless of which party you prefer, the thing that you need to know is that the majority of the government runs day to day on the backs of civil servants, right? That the appointees come and they go, and it is important. Like, the appointees do matter because they do set direction. But there are high level folks in each one of those cabinet agencies who provide the continuity. And there are a number of Christians doing that work who are effectively told, your work doesn't matter, you're just a government paper pusher. And they, to be able to hear, no, your work matters beyond donating money to the church, your work matters beyond evangelizing and beyond not stealing the stapler. Your work matters because God doesn't want people to freeze outside if they have a mental illness. He wants the society to care for them. And so, when I set that thing up with Ruth and Boaz, the thing that I normally go down is that the key to the free markets is, as Acton says, a free and virtuous society. That the markets are only as beneficial as they have virtuous people engaged in them. And the reason that Boaz isn't wealthier than he is, and he's certainly very wealthy, and Scripture never condemns him for it, never slights him for it, but he could have absolutely had more money if he had committed things that were morally wrong, right? I'm going to exploit my workers. I'm going to not pay them on time. I'm going to interact in the trade markets with scales that are specially weighted so I can deceive people and make more money. That it does require a virtuous citizenry. And, as you talk in your book, that's unraveling. This idea of one of the statistics I love in the book is one that I've thought a lot about, is when people hear what the unemployment rate is, they hear, oh, well, the unemployment rate now is down this low. It's down to like 3%. Yeah, that's not the number that you care about. The number that you care about is the number of people who aren't even in the workforce. They're not even looking for work. And so this idea that the church has something to say about a theology of work matters to the GDP, which you talk in your book a little bit about. And I'd love to hear you kind of extend on that, on the idea of why this theology of work matters to things like our gross national product.
Well, the labor participation force you bring up is a great example. When we talk about there's 4% unemployment, I do care about that because it sounds like in that situation, there's 4% of people that want a job and can't find one. And what are the conditions we need in our national economy that could help facilitate more jobs being available to workers? But what the lower and declining labor participation force does is tell me a different statistic. It doesn't tell me how many jobs there are. It tells me how many workers there are. And when there are unfilled jobs because we can't find workers, or when there are humans who are not themselves looking for work, In other words, they have removed themselves from the job force. What are the reasons for that? What is happening in society? Well, are they 80 years old and financially comfortable and they've removed themselves from the workforce? That could be an answer. But in the times we're living in, why are there over 4 million people between the ages of 25 and 35 that have removed themselves from the workforce? And if the answer was because there's a lot of women that have left the workforce to go have children, you'd say, okay, well, that seems kind of logical and natural and likely a really positive thing. But when you find out that it's 3.3 million are men between the ages of 25 and 35, something seems off. The Christian ought to have an opinion about able-bodied men in prime working years, not even in the workforce. And I don't mean looking for jobs and can't find one, or maybe unable to hold down a job or other, issues like that may be problematic. I mean, not looking for work. That is a problem that is at the heart of economic concern. It has moral, spiritual, and all sorts of categories of ramification. And I think that when Christians believe that economics or even sociological issues that play into this are outside of our purview, we miss out an incredibly important part of the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and I agree. One of the things, and kind of what we do here is, I think if you were to ask anybody, Christian or non-Christian, what is it that Christians most care about in the upcoming election? And overwhelmingly, people will say, oh, it's the abortion issue, or it's some kind of, I would say, kind of social, sexual issue. Those are the issues that the church is most known for. But as you mentioned, the church isn't known for speaking into economic issues, into issues of work, into issues of how to function in your job really well. You quoted, I think, Dorothy Sayers, who's like, yeah, your job really is to build a really nice house. So for folks here in Washington, it is to design a really good setup for getting Section 8 housing vouchers that is efficient, that is appropriate, and that is just. And it is defining how and when you're going to launch a drone strike in a way that is careful and thoughtful and things like that. And that I visit a lot of churches in Washington, D.C., and I very rarely, one of the things that I think frequently a pastor will tell me is, yeah, if it's political or even tangentially political, I don't even want to talk about it because it's just too divisive. And in listening to some of your dad's sermons, I've kind of been going through his First Peter sermons. Your dad was not afraid of entering into the world of politics and economics. You want to just talk about what it was like growing up in a house where, to your father, who applied the phrase, there's not one square inch of the world that Christ doesn't declare mine, applied to sermons and sermon topics?
Well, I mean, it's when people, back to your initial question when we started the discussion, when people ask you, how did son of a pastor get into economics and finance? That's how. Because my dad did not teach me to believe that there were two categories of occupation, sacred and secular. There was the ministry things he was doing, and then there would be the worldly things like business or finance or what have you. I do not view what my dad and I do for a living, my late father did for a living, what I currently do for a living, as different. We are engaged in the application of the giftedness that God has given us, the resources God has given us, to the glory of God in growing his kingdom. And my dad did it in the context of a pastorate and a classroom and in Christian scholarship as a renowned intellectual. And I'm seeking to do it in the world of finance and capital allocation and entrepreneurialism. but they're coming from the identical worldview. And that's just a blessing that my father gave me. He died at 47 years old. He was not in a position to leave me much of a material inheritance, but he left me something far more valuable. And that's what it is. He is to think like a believer. And I'm trying my best to do that every day.
One of the things that is happening in this country right now, as you said, Christians are re-engaging. So, I mean, we're re-engaging the public square. We're trying to re-engage in the workplace. And Christians engaging in the public square invariably has ended up with this label of, well, they're trying to create a theocracy. They're trying to create Christian nationalism. So in your dad's kind of theology, one of the things that oftentimes post-millennialism gets connected to is Christian Reconstruction, and then Christian Reconstruction gets connected to the idea of remaking America, and then that gets connected to the idea of Christian nationalism. And there are so many things wrong with that kind of paradigm that it is hard to kind of like know where to start. I'm sure you've heard this about Christian nationalism. I heard you on a podcast that I thought your explanation of Christian nationalism was clearly one of the best that I had ever heard about what it is that is good. And if by that you mean this, yes. If by that you mean this, no. You want to talk a little bit about the connection of how that works?
Do I want to, or am I willing to? Yeah, the notion that somebody of Gregg Bahnsen's, Reformed theology is a predecessor to Christian nationalism is preposterous. That he would have gone to the lengths he did. I'm not a big defender of Rushdoony either, but I must say even Rushdoony was just absolutely explicit that coercion and anything other than gospel transformation was simply not the means by which we would exert leadership and influence in society. Now, as post-millennialists, they believed that they're very optimistically that there was going to be a lot of success in the way that Christianity permeated the world. And I share that optimism. But what we're talking about here is the means to the end. And I think that it would be very difficult for anybody to find a single instance of Gregg Bahnsen suggesting that a Protestant Franco was the way to get there. He went above and beyond to make the point that that was not the way to get there, that faithful Christians, faithful families, faithful churches, faithful communities over time, that the word of God would not be returned to him void, and that eventually he did have a very optimistic outlook in the eschaton throughout history, how the gospel would prevail. I share that optimistic understanding of the gospel, and as it pertains to eschatology, the language is referred to as post-millennialism. Christian nationalism is a very difficult thing to talk about now because the word, the expression, the language is used so differently by so many different people. I choose not to use the language at all because it has never been used. It's never been needed. If what one means is the desire to see nations Christianized, if what one means is the Great Commission. We have talked about the Great Commission, about the cultural mandate, about the Christianization of the Lordship of Christ, a Kuyperian vision, a Calvinist vision. We've talked about these things for centuries without the language Christian nationalism, which is purposely ambiguous, purposely invites questions about ethno-nationalism and an identity of a people that is rooted to something other than ideas, convictions, creeds, and shared beliefs. I believe that the state should be, through time, will kiss the sun. So I do not have any problem at all talking about the Christianization in government, but I do not believe that the cause of a Christian society will be a Christianized government. I believe the effect of a Christianized society will be a Christianized government. And so if believing in Christian nations makes one a Christian nationalist, then I would be a Christian nationalist. But that is not what it means. And the language at this point has become a real problem in this discussion. And so, like my dad, my dad never used the term Christian nationalist. Of course, it wasn't a thing back. He died in the mid 90s. But nationalism has been around a long time. And nationalism was never connected to the Christian theology that you and I are talking about now. And so that's sort of the reason I parse it out the way that I do.
Yuval Levin wrote in this book, A Time to Build, where he talks about the fact that institutions whose job it used to be, or they used to see their job as forming a virtuous citizenry, have really moved into the idea of performance. And that includes the church, it includes secondary education, and it includes the press. And one of the things, the reason I tried to frame the question about Christian nationalism and post-millennialism the way I did is when I'm speaking at churches, I've got a couple slides that I use. One comes from Slate magazine. The other one comes from an article from CNN. The CNN article talks about how the UAW basically was able to organize and shut down all three plants at the same time, all three car companies. But the headline is, there's a new kind of Christianity taking over the public square, and it has nothing to do with white Christian nationalism. And you start reading the article, and it's, oh, hey, the guy who's the head of the UAW is a Christian, and he supports the social gospel. And so I'm reading this thing, and I'm like, okay, so you've just misdefined two things here. The social gospel is not trying to get people's wages up, and you've set it up against something that's not true either.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The other one was, I woke up one morning because my pager or my cell phone was going off, and a guy that I know who's very involved in the government said, hey, congratulations, we're theonomists. I'm like, wait, what? He's like, oh, here's this article. So this Slate article talked about an event that we were both at. Every year, an organization in Washington called Faith and Law has a retreat for congressional staff at a facility near me. In order to have that, they have to go through Senate and House ethics committees because they have to make sure that there's no lobbyists are there. And I get invited just because, I'm a pastoral figure. There's a few other pastors who get invited. But the point of this 3-day retreat is to talk about how to apply your faith to the work that you're doing. That's the entirety of the whole thing, and the outline has to be submitted to these oversight committees. But the way the article gets written is that what these people are doing is planning how to create a theonomy, because the author either doesn't know what the word theonomy means, so he's doing it unintentionally, or he is intentionally misrepresenting what it means for Christians to get together and talk about how to be a Christian in government. And so he decides, I'm going to use the word theonomy, I'm going to connect that to Christian nationalism, and I'm going to use that to scare people.
Sure.
And so in this part of this conversation about Christian nationalism is, it is, well, would you say this? Would you say that the conversation about Christian nationalism is in part being driven by a political agenda? Does that question make sense?
Well, it obviously has a political agenda, and that part wouldn't even necessarily be a problem, but it definitely has a political agenda.
Because I think a lot of the people so when I spoke at Baylor, one of the things I said is, so either this is done unintentionally or it's done intentionally. The difficulty is most of the people reading this article are not Christians. They're not informed Christians. So they read article and they think, oh, they're having theonomy meetings of Christians on the Hill, and that's a bad thing. So how do you think the church, if you were to give advice to people in the church and to pastors about how to talk about this issue, this thing that's happening, in a way that is both disarming and clarifying, what would you have to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. We only have 1 minute left, and I want to do this quickly where it is a complicated issue that requires wisdom depending on the audience. So that's my answer, is to tailor the answer to who you're talking to. Using vocabulary that the people hearing it don't know what it means, don't know the context, don't know the history, don't know the personnel, is unhelpful. Using vocabulary where you know the agenda of the people interpreting it, the Slates and Mother Joneses and the Atlantic, they want a language like Christian nationalism or theocracy or theonomy or whatever the term may be, for the purpose of diminishing and belittling you. There's a legitimate context to some terms and there's an illegitimate one. And I think we're commanded to be wise as serpents and to understand that language matters, and language is often very contextual. And I am somewhat mystified by how many Christians purposely walk into this trap. If they would focus on being faithful and never, ever, ever compromising that Christ is Lord of all, they would have a much easier time navigating the challenges of this world.
Okay. Hey, as we close, will you tell us what you're going to be doing over the course of the next 48 hours?
Over the next 48 hours, I'll be attending the annual National Review Gala in Chicago, Illinois, where we are presenting the William Buckley Prize to Father Sirico, the previously mentioned co-founder of the Acton Institute. And then I will be back in New York City, appearing on Fox News and doing my normal routine in New York. So just a regular 48 hours ahead. No big deal.
Well, we certainly appreciate the fact that you are well received enough that you can be up both on Fox News and MSNBC. That is a testimony to the work of Christ and the opportunity for the gospel to be advanced. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Appreciate you having me. God bless.
That's it for the Faithful Presence podcast, this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this, what I'm supposed to tell you is to like it, to leave a review, to forward it to other people, because there's algorithm people out there who care about that thing, who make it show up more often. Want to really thank our guest, David Bahnsen, today for taking time out of his extraordinarily busy schedule to come on the podcast and answer questions from me. Thank you to everybody here and for all the work that you do in your places where God has placed you. And now, until we get together again, may your Father in heaven make you one, as he and his Son are one, so that the world will know that he loves them and sent his Son for them. Amen. Carry on.